Welcome everyone. So happy to be learning with you again in this special new class. This is Conversations on the Parashah. Each week we will have different members from Drisha's learning community. And this week we're hearing from Rabbi Alex Israel and Miss Rachel Gelfman Schultz. So good to have you both with us. Just a few words about how we run the class. I will be sending invitations to all the attendees to become panelists. Once you accept that invitation, you'll be able to unmute and ask questions during class or make comments. Otherwise, you can also engage by writing comments in the chat box here on Zoom or as a comment on Facebook if you're watching us live. Just a reminder to stay muted when you're not actively speaking, and then whenever you would like to speak, you can unmute yourself. A few words about our lecturers today. Rabbi Alex Israel is a popular international lecturer, author, and podcaster teaching at Midreshet Lindenbaum and Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi. Rachel Gelfman Schultz is a writer and Jewish educator specializing in teaching students in the conversion process. So glad you both are with us, and I'll turn this to you.
Okay, great. Hi, Rachel. Good to see you.
Hello.
Okay, so we're delighted both to be with you and excited to start the shiur. And Parashat Yitro, gosh, there is such a wealth of topics that we could talk about. Yitro, the 10 Commandments, the preparation for Har Sinai, the response to Har Sinai. The topic that I've chosen to speak about today is Yitro, and I've actually called this class The Search for Meaning in a World of Endless Choices. And maybe let me give a little introduction, and then maybe Rachel, you'll give me some thoughts before we even get into our texts. So a few years ago, I was teaching a class of teachers. I was involved actually in the Matan Institute, teaching some educators. And at the beginning of the year, I said to the educators, what are the issues that come up in your classroom? You know, what are the things you're interested in? What do you want to talk about? And each one gave their topics. And the last teacher to speak was the most experienced. She had like 30 years of educational experience under her belt. And she said, you know, I don't know how exactly to pinpoint this, but I'm finding that my students sort of are lacking a sense of what they want to achieve in life, a sense of their own ideology. She said, I remember growing up, and these ones were the crazy Zionist students, and these ones were the socialist students, and everybody was sort of on a mission or had an ideology. And I find, she said, with my students, that they just sort of a bit blah. You'll say to me, maybe it's the effects of COVID, that they're being too long out of school, but this was already happening before COVID. So she feels that somehow they're lacking a sense of motivation. She feels that maybe they're lacking a sense of something propelling them. And this got me really thinking. To be honest, since I know that my youngest son is not watching, it resonated with me because of one of my children. I felt like, really, you know, like he'd sit in his room and he was doing a PhD in YouTube or Netflix or whatever it was, scrolling through his Instagram feed. But like, no, you know, what are you going to do? What are you going to do this today? And it rang a bell, and it got me thinking. And I started actually reading up a lot on the question of meaning. Where does meaning come from? In fact, I came across a wonderful academic. She's got a fabulous TED Talk, a woman called Emily Esfahani Smith, who has a whole understanding of, she said, it's actually called, I think her TED Talk's called The Search for Happiness. And she says, everybody's looking for happiness, but really, we find happiness when we find meaning. And she says, how do you find meaning in life? And she actually articulates it with 4 pillars of meaning. The first pillar, for example, she says, is about belonging. She says, where do you belong? Who do you belong to? So that's one. She even speaks about the sense of people who have a very strong sense of belonging to their family. She talks about some island off America where, it's a bit like a kibbutz. Everybody knows everyone. There's one elementary school, there's one secondary school, and everybody knows everybody. And then when they go to the mainland, they're a bit lost because they're used to really belonging. Then the second one is purpose. The third one is transcendence. Transcendence could be nature, meditation, or religion, or whatever. By the way, this woman, Emily Esfahani Smith, she grew up in a Sufi household where her home was a Sufi prayer house and a Sufi bet midrash. So she had this sense of transcendence. And the last one, interestingly enough, is storytelling. Can you tell your story? Are you aware of your story? Anyway, it was fascinating, this interesting discussion about, now, by the way, our religion gives us a lot of those things. It gives us a sense of belonging. You belong to a shul or you have a sense of purpose. You have a sense of transcendence. I don't know, hopefully, right? Some shuls aren't so transcendent, but okay, let's hope. And maybe, you also have an ability to tell your story, or at least we do that every Seder night in some way. I think Israelis too have a lot of these things. I'll mention one last thing, and then Rachel, I'm going to hand over to you for a couple of thoughts, and then we'll dive into Yitro. I want to say one further thing in this little introduction about meaning, because it's not going to be immediately obvious how this is going to connect to Yitro, but I hope at the end, all of this is going to coalesce. A while back, I was listening to a rabbi online called Rav Eli Ofran. He's a wonderful rabbi. He's a practicing psychologist. He's the rabbi of Kibbutz Yavneh, a very experienced educator, wonderful, wonderful teacher, the grandson of Yeshayahu Leibovich, actually, as well. And he was recording something for a site called Cheder HaShe'elot, which is a site of Ne'emanei Torah Avodah where they have like 5-minute short question and answer videos for teenagers. And he was asked the question, and he was making a video about how do I find my meaning in life, right? Which teenager hasn't asked that question? How do I find my meaning? How do I know what to do? I remember asking that question at age 16 last week. I'm joking. Okay, so how do I find my meaning in life? And he gave a really interesting metaphor or a analogy. He said, when I was dating, don't worry, this guy's already, he's 40, 50 years old. I don't know how old he is. But he said, when I was dating, I went out on the first date and I said, do I like her? Do I not like her? The second date, I said, do I like her? Do I not like her? I could stop dating or I could keep on dating. And I could keep on asking myself after dates, do I like her? Do I still want to go out with her? He said, but when I stopped asking that question? When we got engaged. When we got engaged, the questions changed. It wasn't, do I like her or do I not like her? Now the question was, what are we going to build together? What sort of house are we going to build together? How's our house going to look like? In other words, what he actually said was, when you're standing on the outside, you ask, am I in or am I not in? Is this good or is that good? Isn't it? Says, but the minute you commit to something, you're actually engaged in a process, a different type of process. The commitment enables us to dig into a deeper level where we actually start building something. And now the question isn't, should I, shouldn't I? The question is, how should I engage in this? How should I enrich this experience? How do I take this to a higher level? And therefore, he said, by flitting around, right, you're not going to necessarily find meaning. Where are you going to find meaning? When you invest in something. When you actually invest in a particular project, when you invest with a community, when you take on a role of responsibility, then you will find meaning by your very involvement. So that's a little introduction about meaning, and I hope maybe it won't sound like it connects so much in the next half hour, but when we get to the end of the hour, I hope it really will. Rachel, I just wanted to hear where maybe you had some thoughts on this topic or,
Yes, thank you. It's a fascinating question. I think especially complex in our times where we have a sense of belonging to multiple communities often, and also sense of commitment to multiple causes, and what does it mean when we have to juggle them, and how does that, I mean, there are pros and cons, obviously, to having multiple communities and multiple commitments. What do we gain? What do we lose?
I'd like to say even more than that. I think it's a harder sell for this generation. And maybe this is an answer to my school teacher, that we have so many options today. We can, through the internet, we can pretty much be anywhere, watch anything, right? I can see the age of the majority of people on this call, right? There was a time when you watched whatever was on TV. You couldn't just like download something, right? What was on, and you watched it whether you liked it or not, right? And you argued about whether you're going to watch channel 1 or channel 2 or channel 3, but it was, and you went to the shop, and if they didn't have the shirt in yellow, so you had to choose, I'll get the gray or the blue. Now you just go onto Amazon and you order it in exactly the right, endless choices. And maybe it's too much sometimes, right? It's too much. Dan Ariely, the industrial psychologist, right? He spoke about a very interesting experiment. There was a jam company, selling jams, and they made something like 20 flavors of jam. So they put out a whole array in supermarkets with 20 types of jam, and people would come over and take a look. And then they tried a different, and even though they had a lot of people coming along, they actually didn't buy so much. And then they changed their display, and the display just showed 5 jams. Fewer people came over, but more people bought. More people purchased the jam. Why? Because 20 jams are dazzling. Wow, my gosh, they've got this flavor and that flavor. But how am I going to make that decision? And I just get dazzled and I walk off, right? Because I can't decide, maybe blueberry or blackberry or apricot and vanilla. And but when you have 5, you can actually make a choice, or 6, you can make a choice. So it's really interesting. Maybe fewer choices makes it easier to choose.
Or maybe in today's age, we buy 3 jams and alternate between them, as it were.
There you go. All right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get into the story of Yitro. And I don't know whether people are listening, whether people can write on the chat, or if people want to talk, but maybe I'm going to throw out the question, since I'm sure lots of people here actually know the story of Yitro. When you think of Yitro, Jethro, the biblical character of Jethro, what sort of things pop out at you when you think about him? What, in a sense of Tanakh, what does he represent? Maybe somebody wants to, you can write in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves. And character Jethro, what does it conjure up in your mind? Ruth says an enigma. An enigma. Anyone else? I'll give maybe a chance if somebody, another minute, another few seconds, if somebody wants to comment.
Sure. Sage advice.
Sage advice. I love that. Okay. Advice. Beautiful. The first management consultant. Okay.
Sage advice
and
judicial reform. Judicial reform.
Okay. I think you might be referring to some current events here. So a man who knows how to make judicial reform. We've got in the chat from Wayne Gelfman, wise in leadership. Okay, a sense of a leader. And Anne writes here, seeker, a role model for Moshe. So I love these answers. Okay, we've got a question of leadership. We've got the question of a seeker, and Reba is going to say something we're going to get to in a little while. Thank you so much for that comment. Okay, that he had the opportunity to join Bnei Israel but declined, and that's a really interesting point, and we're going to come back to that. So this is perfect. So let's take a look. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you have the sheet. If you don't, just follow along with me, and let's take a look at what we have. I hope people can see on the screen. I'm going to read the story relatively quickly, because I want to get on to sort of commentary and to deeper levels. So let's see what we can do. Great. And it's been shared in the chat. There's a short source sheet there if you want to avail yourself of that. Great. Beautiful. So we start off with Vayishma Yitro Kohen Midyan Chotei Moshe. We have Yitro who's described as, well, first of all, I want to pay attention to the first word, Vayishma. He hears about things. A lot of times we hear about things, but what do we do about them? He hears and he does. Vayishma Yitro, he hears. He's described as Kohen Midyan. First of all, he's a priest, a religious man, a leader, it would seem, of Midyan, Chotei Moshe, Moshe's father-in-law, and Kol Asher Asa Elohim LeMoshe u'Yisrael. He heard everything that God had done for Moshe and for Israel, his people. Ki Hotzi Hashem Israel miMitzrayim. So he seems to have heard about Yitziat Mitzrayim. And I've missed out a few verses here, so please excuse me. Okay. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' son and wife to him in the wilderness where he was encamped at the mountain of God. And Moses recounted to his father-in-law, Vaysaper Moshe lechotono, et kol asher asa Hashem leparo leMitzrayim al odot Yisrael, et kol hatzlah Hashem atzatem b'derech v'yitzileim Hashem. So what do we now hear? Not just about the Exodus, but everything that God did to Pharaoh and Egypt, about Israel, all of the hardships that had befallen them on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. I wonder what stories that means. Is that Kriyat Yamsuf? Is that Amalek? Is that the stories of the food? And now look at this. Let's see Yitro's reaction. Vayichad Yitro. Yitro was, most people translate this from the word chedva, right? Same word as chedva, joy. Vayichad, he rejoiced. Al kol haTorah asher asa Hashem Yisrael, asher hitzilo miyad Mitzrayim. So he rejoiced on all the goodness that God had done to Israel, that he had saved them from Egypt. Vayomer Yitro, and now Yitro is going to speak. And he says, Baruch Hashem, asher hitzil etchem miyad Mitzrayim. Blessed be the Lord who delivered you from the Egyptians and from Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hands of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods. Yes, by the result of their very screams against the people. Ate adati ki gadol Hashem mikol Elohim ki davar asher zadu aleihem. Vayikach Yitro chotei Moshe Ula uzmachim leElohim vayavo Aaron v'chol ziknei Yisrael echol lechem michotei Moshe lifnei Elohim. The question is, what exactly makes Yitro so excited? And there seems to be one word, I think, which pops out for me. And that is this word which I'm highlighting as we speak, this word of Hatzalah. It comes up 4 times. Baruch Hashem asher hitzil etchem miyad Mitzrayim, asher hitzil et ha'am. There's a sense of Hatzalah. He's very excited, and he even says, Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol Elohim. Now I know that this God is greater than all other gods, which is really fascinating. By the way, if you take a look down on your source sheets, try not to make you too dizzy, look at source number 3. Now I know that God is greater than all the deities. This teaches us that Yitro was knowledgeable about every type of idolatry in the world, and there was no pagan deity that he did not worship. Yitro was some sort of a seeker. He had tried, he'd been in an ashram in India. He tried, he was a born-again Christian. He had tried, this and that and the other. He'd been to Burning Man. He'd done it all, right? And now he says, but now I've heard of this God, Asher Hitzil, who saved you. Wow, this is amazing. Interesting question, why this Hatzalah is so impressive. What's so impressive about it? Let's maybe say one other thing about Yitro, this sense of Lo hiniach Yitro avodah zarah b'chol ha'olam shelo chazar eleh va'avda. Yitro didn't have a religion that he didn't try. And by the way, according to Rashi, I have to say, Yitro, when he says, now I know that God is greater than all other gods, and when he brings sacrifices to God, what he's actually doing here is he's sort of like adopting Judaism as his true religion. So let's take one other look at the Mechilta, source number 2. Vayishma Yitro, Shiva Shemot Nikru'u lo. He has 7 names. Yeter, Yitro, Chovav, Ruel, Chever, Putiel, Keni. I don't even need to go further than this opening line. I'll simply say a name is always an identity, correct? You know, when you name somebody and when people change, their name changes. Avram changed to Avram, Sarai changed to Sarah. Hoshea turned to Yoshua. Yosef changed to Tzofnat Paneach, right? We have all the changes in names, which sometimes even in the case of Avram and Sarah, it induced a physiological change. They weren't able to have children and then they were. 7 names is 7 identities. Yitro is a man who's constantly changing. He's an unbelievable seeker. He's always looking for something. He's unsettled. But what does he really believe in and what seems to go with him? What seems to happen here is that he really loves this idea of Hatzalah, right? He loves this idea. And the fact that God decided to save the slaves, right, seems to be very, very, go to the depths of what he finds so amazing that he can say, I've checked out all the religions, but there's no religion like this. And I wonder how this relates to the second bit of the parasha. It sounds like people know it, but I'll just quickly read. The next day, Moses sat as a magistrate amongst the people while the people stood about Moses from morning till evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw how much he had to do for the people, he said, what are you doing to the people? Why do you act alone? All the people standing from morning till evening. Once again, he's worried about the people. He's worried about the little people. And Moses said, people have come to inquire God. When they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make known the laws and teachings of God. And he says, what you're doing is not right. You'll wear yourself out and the people as well. So he gives him counsel and he tells him to appoint judges, a whole hierarchy of judges, and this is what he does. Yitro seems mesmerized by the notion of justice and making sure there is access to the law, making sure that everybody's looked after. This seems to be something that attracts him. So I'm going to try and examine this, but I want to give maybe Rachel a chance to. I don't know if Rachel has anything she wants to add at this point.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another, in the thinking of Yitro as a seeker, it's interesting that he's a Kohen. In other words, he's a religious leader. You normally think of like the religious leaders are the ones who've found and committed to something. But he is a religious leader who's still a seeker, and still he's both a religious leader and a seeker, which is interesting. And of course, also how that impacts on the advice he gives as well, that he is someone who is a leader in his own community and has that accumulated wisdom. But the fact that he's a Kohen as if implies that maybe he, I don't know, if he did have some kind of religious commitment at some point, or I'm not sure. It's an interesting question.
He's a religious leader who isn't satisfied with something about religion. And maybe there's something going on here. You know, I want to show you one other source. It's on page 3, but I'll just point it out. The original attraction between Yitro and Moshe. You all remember the story. Yeah, I'll highlight it just to make sure you can see where I am. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they were picked on by the well. And the shepherds came and drove them away, and Moses rose to their fence and he watered their flocks. And they come to their father and he says, how is it that you came back so soon? And what do they say? Vatomru ish mitzri hatzilanu miyad haroim. An Egyptian man rescued us from the shepherds, and he even drew water for us and watered the flock. So what does he say? Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Like, I want to meet this guy. I love people who save people, right? And ask him in to break bread. And really interestingly is, Vayol Moshe l'shevet ish. Who did Moshe fall in love with? Moshe agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moshe his daughter as Zipporah as a wife. It seems like Moshe and Yitro have, I think, what they call in common language today, a bromance, right? They have something in common. They're both committed to this notion of Hatzalah. So let me maybe try and say something a little bit about this, and then we'll try and maybe position where this fits in. I always wondered why, for example, this would be so astounding to Yitro. And he says, Baruch Hashem, wow. And according to Rashi, now I found the God. And here I'm drawing on writings that I've read in the work of Nachum Sarna, Rabbi Sachs, and others, who all talk about how that the world of mythology, the world of paganism, was a very hierarchical world. You have this image of the pantheons of the gods, where the gods tend to act a bit like human beings, I have to say, right? Gods in the pagan world compete with one another, backstab the other, have sex, have children, are jealous of one another, all sorts of things, right? In the pagan world, the gods are in the image of man. In our religion, man's in the image of God. But the world of paganism is a world of hierarchy, and it's a world of power. Whoever can exert power on the other one is the strongest. By the way, that's beautifully expressed in the Midrash about Avram Avinu smashing the idols. Now, Avram Avinu, what does he do? He's got all the idols, and somebody comes in to bring an offering, and he smashes all the idols and put the club in the hands of the biggest one. And the father comes in and says, what happened? He says, well, there was some food, and they all fought, and the biggest one won, which is how paganism is how it works, right? The ultimate God is the head of the pantheon. And he says, well, they can't do that. And he says, well, listen to what you're saying. But the point is, what he's showing is that's the method. So now here's the chiddush. Here's the innovation. This is the God of the little people. When have we ever had a God of the slaves? When have we ever had a God who takes the side of the underdog? In most cultures, the king was designated by the god to be the demigod of that country. That was definitely true about Pharaoh. If you read about ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh would go out every morning in his boat and welcome the sun Ra on the river. And that's why Moshe always goes to meet him in the morning by the river. And the god would be, the Pharaoh was the representative of the gods. The gods were always on the side of the powerful. Yitro apparently believes in justice. Now, let me say a word about justice. Justice is also about, if in a dog-eat-dog world where there's no justice, where it's just a world of power, you don't need judges, because the powerful will have their way. A judge is generally there to protect the weak and to make sure things are equitable. So I find it very interesting. There seems to be something about Yitro where he's attracted to justice, and he's attracted to making sure that the little people are looked after. If you understand what I mean, that everybody gets a fair chance. And this is where I actually would like to say a word about Yitro and where Yitro fits into the story. Because there are actually many commentaries who say that Yitro, this story about Yitro, is actually out of place. It really happened much later on in the story of the wilderness. And if you take a look here, Yitro's in a really interesting location. We've got the story of Yitro's arrival and sacrifice in chapter 18, and Yitro's management advice in 18b. Oops, that was a mistake. Never mind. Sorry about that. And it's there right between Amalek in chapter 17 and Matan Torah. Okay? Now, either the story of Yitro relates to Amalek, either it's in place, that's the Rambam's opinion, but if it's not in place, it either relates to Amalek or to Matan Torah. So let's take a look. And let's look at the Ibn Ezra source number 4, which you see on your screen. And he says, Lama nichnasa parashat Yitro b'makom hazeh? What's Yitro doing at this point? Because the Torah mentioned the evil manner in which Amalek treated Israel, or the damage that Amalek did to Israel. Now his kir kenegdo. In contrast to it, it mentions Hatova she'asa Yitro Israel. In other words, now the question is, of course, what is this? Just like we had some non-Jews who were mean to us, so we want to show you the Goyim don't hate us, so we'll bring you a nice story about a Gentile who's kind to us. Is that what it is? So I think it goes deeper than that. And I believe, since I'm talking here on a Drisha podcast, I will say that what I'm about to say now, I remember hearing many, many years ago in a shir by Rabbi Silber. I think he gave a shir in Alon Shvut, and he alerted me to this kasuto and to this particular parallel, which I'm about to show. It's not just that Yitro comes after Amalek. There are some amazing textual parallels, which you see in the table in front of you. Sorry, I didn't translate it, between Yitro and Amalek. And let me explain. First of all, the stories begin with the same phrase. Vayavo Amalek, Vayavo Yitro. Okay. Well, why do I keep on doing this? And Vayavo Yitro. Then if you look in source number 2, when Moshe is fighting Amalek, Vayomer Moshe Yoshua, Bachar lanu anashim, choose men to go and fight. But if you look in the second story, Vayivchar Moshe Anshe Chayil Mikol Yisrael. The judges are called, interestingly enough, Anshe Chayil. Sounds like soldiers, but really they were judges. Mikol Yisrael. So the same verb, Vayivchar, and choosing people. Then we've got the notion of Machar. Moses says, tomorrow I'm standing on the hill, right? And Vahimi Mocharat. And then we have a theme of standing and sitting, right? Moshe's sitting. And if you look on line number 5, we've got the notion of standing from morning till evening. The people are standing, Moses is sitting. But if you remember in the story with Amalek, he's standing on the hill, and then he gets tired, and eventually has to sit down, right? And he needs support. And you've got that word kaved. And what does Yitro say to him? Ki kaved mincha hadavar. This is going to be too heavy for you. You're going to wear yourself out. Just like in Amalek, his hands were in the air and they got worn out and he needed support and assistance. So we've got the theme of tomorrow, from morning till evening, from standing, sitting, hands being heavy. Very similar. And even both stories end up with the building of a Mizbeach. The end of the Amalek story, Mizbeach, when Yitro comes, he builds a Mizbeach, an altar. What's going on? I don't quite remember how Rabbi Silber phrased it, so I'll have to put it in my own words. I would put it this way. Amalek is a story of a nation who rules by might. Might is right. They see that Israel have come out of Egypt. They're vulnerable. They are Ayefe Yagea. They're in the wilderness. They're exposed. I'd say more than that. They have not only wealth, but they have water, which is priceless in the desert, right? Because Moshe just hit the rock. And they come to attack and take their stuff. Why not? Who's stopping us? In other words, Amalek are the exploiters. They are exactly those who are strong and try to take down like thieves in the night, they are violent people. And that's why I think we have a vendetta against them, because they represent a complete absence of morality. They are literally the force of power, of abusing the weak and sucking them dry. Yitro is exactly the opposite. Yitro is the antithesis of Amalek. By the way, both Amalek and Midian are both nomadic peoples. There's no, we know there are classic neighbors of Israel: Edom, Moab, Ammon, Aram, Sidon, the Plishtim. Those are all geographical locations, but there's no Eretz Midian and there's no Eretz Amalek. Why? Because they're nomads. Sometimes they settle. So it's interesting. Amalek and Midian could both be the same. But Yitro from Midian values justice. He values looking after. He values Hatzalah. Amalek are the marauders. They're the ones. They're the bullies. So literally one is the inverse of the other. One is the complete reverse of the other. And after we've just told Amalek, maybe Yitro is there to restore our faith in the world, to show us that not everybody is this way. Maybe to teach us that we can learn both from the inverse, from the negative and the positive. Some people have actually said that he actually comes before Matan Torah to teach us that sort of derech eretz kanman Torah, that you don't need a revelation to teach you the values of decency and justice. Those are universal values. We have our own covenant, which we get from God, but those universal values we can get from anywhere. In which case, it's not only relating to Amalek, but it's also relating to Matan Torah. Rachel, anything you would like to add? This is a great point.
Yeah, well, two things. And first of all, obviously also that Amalek attacks Dafka attacks from behind. He attacks the weakest point of the Israelites. Also, another interesting thing that if Amalek is all about power, it's interesting that Yitro's sort of lesson to Moshe is to share the power, like not to keep the power all to himself. Relating, of course, to Ki kaved mimcha davar, that it's too much for you, that power shouldn't maybe be concentrated all in one person.
I like that. That's great. That's fabulous. Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you. Okay, so by the way, if anybody else would like to contribute a comment or a question.
Yeah. Oh, also Stacy
really...
asked the question a bit earlier. Isn't it very Jewish to be unsatisfied and seeking? It's interesting.
Oh, sorry, I didn't have the.
Yeah, in
maybe.
The chat.
I think it depends which Jewish community you're in. There are some quite complacent Jewish communities. If you think it's very Jewish to be unsatisfied and seeking, then you're in a good Jewish community, I think. I'm gonna. I think that's a very positive and humble place to be. I've come to some very, very smug and I don't know what I'd say communities, but I shouldn't be talking Lashon Hara. Okay, so it should be a Jewish quality, 100%. Okay, I'm going to now, after I've sort of presented, let's just try and summarize. I've tried to present Yitro as sort of this seeker looking for the truth. And one of the things that seems to animate him is a sort of almost a universal sense of justice, a sense that people should have their dignity, people should have their rights, and spreading the power, etc. And now I want to go into what is, I would think, a little bit of a challenge with Yitro. If you've learned Rashi will call Yitro Hager, because the way Rashi understands it is that when Yitro says I'll go back to page 1 for a second, when Yitro says before, or you can even look here, Ata Yadati, now I know that God is greater than all other deities, it means, right, that he had tried every religion, but now he sacrifices to God. Now he's converted. Now he has taken on duties. However, I want to throw a little sort of wrench into this, because if you look at the last line, Vayishlach Moshe et chotano, vayelech lo el arzo. Moses bade his father-in-law farewell, and he went on his way to his own land. Why does Yitro leave before Matan Torah? Why does Yitro leave if he's so interested, if Rashi's right, and he really wants to become a convert, he wants to become Jewish, stay for the big events. Stay to hear God speaking to the people. Stay to receive the Torah. Now, the thing is, this is not the only time the Yitro leaves prematurely. And I know the sources are in a sort of funny order here, so please bear with me. But we're going to look at source number 8. Source number 8. Now, this is a year later. The Israelites have been at Har Sinai for a year. They've heard the Torah. They've done the golden calf. They've had the second tablets. They've built the Mishkan. They've dedicated the Mishkan. And they're about to leave Mount Sinai and embark for the promised land. And therefore, you read here in Bamidbar chapter 10, Moses said to Chovav, son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law. Again, it's, by the way, unclear whom is Moses' father-in-law. Is it Chovav or is it Reuel? So this is either Yitro or Yitro's son. And he says, we're setting out for the place of which the Lord has said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we'll be generous for you, for the Lord has promised to be generous to Israel. Now, this word generous in Hebrew is a much more simple word. Okay, the word here is v'hitavnu lach, tov, ki Hashem diber tov al Yisrael, right? And there's this sense of a lot of tov going out. And what does Yitro respond? I will not go, he replied to him. I want to return home to my native land. He said, please don't leave us, inasmuch as you can be our guide. You have ayita lanu le'enayim. And Yitro doesn't respond. But we think that Yitro really did leave them. He didn't go with them. Because he gets the last word and says, because Moshe says, please, please, please come, and he doesn't say anything. He'd already said he wanted to go home. So there's something very strange here. Yitro doesn't stay for Matan Torah, he leaves. By the way, I should say Midian seems to be quite close to Har Sinai. How do I know that? Because if you recall in chapter 3 of Shemot, in the story of the burning bush, Moshe was pasturing Yitro's flocks, and he chanced upon a burning bush, which was on the Mount of God in Horeb. So it seems like certainly Har Sinai is within shepherding distance of Midian, or of the Midianite centers, right? They seem to be relatively close. What I'm saying is, Yitro could have very easily come when he knew that Israel were close by, brought the family, given his management consultancy, gone back home, and then as they're leaving Har Sinai, they send a message to Yitro, and Yitro comes to say goodbye. And Moshe says, hey, come with us. And he says, I'm going home. I've got a job. I've already got a priest. I'm a priest. I've got a job to do. I'm going back. This is not the only place that we find Yitro or Yitro characters as, how should I say it, not quite willing to commit to Bnei Israel. So let me show you another great two examples. Well, I'm going to show you three. Source number 5, source number 6, and then we'll jump to the end of the source sheet. Source number 5, we're going to meet Yael. Do you remember Yael? She's the person you don't want to meet if she's walking down a dark alley, if she's carrying her tent peg. Okay? That's Yael. Okay? Now, Yael is part of a group of people called the Keni, and the Keni are apparently part of Yitro's family. Let's read it. Now, Chever the Kenites, that's a husband, has separated from the other Kenites, descendants of Chovav, father-in-law of Moses. So Chever the Keni is descended from Yitro, and he has pitched his tent at Elon B'Tzananim Asher et Kadesh. Now, apparently we're going to meet Yael, the wife of Chever of the Keni. And what do we hear about this family? There was friendship between King Yavin and Chatzor and the family of Chever the Keni. In other words, who is the Keni's allies? Our enemy, Yavin and Sisra. By the way, Sisra is Yavin's army general. So when Sisra has to flee, who does he flee to? He goes to, look at verse 17. Sisra nasbar agla bel ol Yael eshet Chever HaKeni ki shalom ben Yavin melech Chatzor ben Chever HaKeni. So in other words, Sisra thinks that it's safe to go to the tent of the Keni. It's his friend, Chever, and his wife, Yael. But at the critical moment, verse 18, Yael came out to greet Sisra, and she said, come in my Lord, come in here, don't be afraid, right? And she tells him, right, she covers him with a blanket, and she gives him milk, and, you know, the rest is history. In other words, Yael, or the Keni family, are sitting, and they've got double allegiances. On the one hand, they're an ally of our enemies. On the other hand, when it serves them, they're an ally of Israel. Get it? And at the critical moment, she switched. She saw the advantage was on the side of the Jews, so she decided to attack Sisra and be on the side of the winning side. But she played her bets very well. But it's really interesting how until the very last minute, she could serve as a double agent because Sisra assumed that she was on his side. Here's another case where we see the Keni as being in an in-between space, a liminal space, living next to Israel, but between Israel and our enemies. Look at source number 6, the Haftorah for Shabbat Zachor, the story of Shmuel, Shaul and Amalek. Vayavo Shaul ad Ir Amalek, Vayar Benachal. Shaul came, advanced as far as the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the wadi. And Shaul said he's about to attack Amalek, and he says to the Keni, come withdraw from among the Amalekites, that I may not destroy you along with them, for you showed kindness to Israel when they left Egypt. So the Keni withdrew from among the Amalekites. Fascinating. Okay? Why is it that the Keni are always in between? They're always in this liminal space. They are Switzerland. They are not staking a claim. Then we're sort of between Israel and Israel's enemies, and our dreadful enemies like Amalek. Now I want to drive this even deeper. And here I'm going to go later in history to a passage in Jeremiah. And here we're going to meet some people called the Bnei Beit HaRechavim, the people who are the people of the Rechavites, who are descended from somebody called Yonadav, son of Rechav. Yonadav ben Rechav. Now you're going to wonder, who are these people? So I'll simply tell you to look at source number 12. The family of the scribes that dwelt in Yavetz, the Tirathites, the Shemaites, the Sukkites. These are the Cani who came from Hamat, the father of the house of Rechav. This is all we have to know. Cani, we know who the Cani are. Cani is descended from Yitro, and they are connected to Beit Rechav. Now let's read about them. Jeremiah wants to rebuke the people of Jerusalem. And this is what he says. I set bowls full of wine and cups before the men of the house of the Rechavites, and I said to them, have some wine. And they said, we don't drink wine. Because our ancestor Yonadav ben Rechav said to us, never drink wine, either your children, nor will you build houses or sow fields or plant vineyards, nor shall you own such things, but you should live in tents all your days, so you may live long upon the land where you sojourn. Never build a house, never sow a field, never plant a vineyard. Only live in this tent. Now, what is this all about? And we don't drink wine. So I'll tell you a little story. I studied in yeshiva for many years, and that means I lived in yeshiva dorms for many years. Now, I'll tell you one of the problems of living in a yeshiva dorm. In yeshiva dorms, you have your bed to sit on, and you have a wooden chair. But I always had a problem in yeshiva dorms. There was no armchair. There was no couch. There was nowhere to sit comfortably. What can I tell you? You want to read a book? You want to sit on the couch? So the day came when I got married, and I was really happy to get married. But I was also really happy because we got an apartment and we had our couch delivered. Right? I promise you I was very happy to marry my wife, but I was also very delighted about the couch. And the day the couch came along, it was delivered. And my wife is looking miserable. Now, it wasn't that sort of like I was in love with the couch instead of her, don't worry. But I said to her, why are you miserable? I said, what, you don't like the couch? She says, no, I love the couch. I said, what, you don't like the color? She said, no, the color's great. I said, it's not comfortable. She said, no, it's very comfortable. I said, so why are you looking so down? She goes, I'll tell you why. She said, until now, I could pack everything I own into 2 duffel bags and I could take it wherever I like. And now we need a truck to move our stuff. She was suffering from, the beginnings, the early settings on of middle age, right? I'm joking. There's something beautiful about being the B'nai Rechav. You don't have commitments. If you don't like the country you're living in, you just move. You pick up your tent and off you move. You haven't planted anything. You haven't built a house. You don't need to leave anything behind. Right? My children who tell me I'm desperately middle-aged, how did I get to be this pathetic middle-aged person? Right? I tell them because I bought a house and I sent you to a school. And then if I don't like the rabbi of the shul, well, there's a shul in this area. I can't really move because, well, I've got to move you out of school and I've got to sell the house. And maybe it's not a good time in the property market and God knows what. So what you end up doing is you end up settling. It's settling, right? You end up compromising. That's a terrible, terrible thing to do. And therefore, Yitro people always live independently. They're not part of Israel. They're not part of Israel's enemy. They live on the borderlands, on the liminal space. They don't plant a house. They don't plant fields. They don't buy a house. They're clean. They're clean. What's the price they pay? The price they pay is they never build anything. They never build anything, right? In other words, I'll put it. Moshe says to Yitro, come to the land of Israel. So you know what he says? He says, I don't always agree with IDF policy. I don't always agree with what Tzahal do. I don't always like the government in Israel. They're not okay, but if you're not going to be willing to put in a stake for your country, even though everybody knows that you're sometimes going to disagree with your country, but then you won't build anything, right? If I don't, so he says, stay for Matan Torah. And Yitro says, well, maybe some of the laws won't be so ethical. I don't like women's rights in Judaism, and Judaism allows for slavery. So everybody's got their mitzvahs they don't like, right? But if you don't commit to a system, you don't have a system. You can't be part of a people, and you can't, right? So every government, whether I lived in England or whether I lived in America or whether I lived in Israel or wherever I would live, there's problems with the country. What you're not going to, do you understand what I'm trying to say? So there's something very purist about Yitro, or about Canaan, but there's something which is very problematic. And here, let me maybe just show you two sources, and then I want to give Rachel a chance to say something, and then we'll maybe come back to one last idea. Just let me show you one other source, one fascinating source, source 7. When Paro said, he decided to enslave the Jews. There were 3 people who were his advisors: Bilam, Eov, and Yitro. Bilam was the one who came up with the idea because he really secretly hates the Jews, and he was killed. Job was silent, and he judged to suffer in great pain. But what did Yitro do? He ran away. Yitro decided to leave government. Government work was too dirty, right? And therefore what he did was he resigned and went to live in Midian. He lived outside civilization. He went to live in the desert. He withdrew. And this is really interesting because on the one hand, Yitro, so in other words, what am I trying to say? I'm saying Yitro is dedicated to justice, and justice is blind, and justice is true whether you're rich or whether you're poor or whether you're a citizen or you're a non-citizen. There's a Bill of Rights, and it applies to every human being. And Yitro's into justice, and he loves Hatzalah. He loves those pure values, but he won't stay for Matan Torah. He won't become part of the Jewish people. Does he build anything? So that's what I'm sort of thinking about. And in a minute, after Rachel's given us her wisdom, I'll say one last thing. Yes, Rachel.
Yeah, it's just thinking about what you're saying about Yitro loving pure justice. But on the other hand, to complicate matters, his advice to Moshe is actually not about pure justice. In other words, his advice to Moshe is like, you've got to, is more of a compromise in many ways. I was just reading Rabbi Sachs quotes the Nitziv, who says that Moshe was like incapable of compromise. He is incapable of mediation. He saw, like, people came before him and he immediately saw, you're right, you're wrong, like sort of the Yitro model of justice, like pure justice. And he could never—
Divine justice.
What? Divine justice, is that what you said?
Divine justice, right, sort of thing, yeah.
Exactly. And once he delegated, then that meant that people came on the scene who were judging that were capable of compromise, what Moshe was incapable of, that they could make what's called in, the pshara, like doing mediation, compromise. So
right.
Basically by his advice, he's enabling some form of compromise into the justice system of Israel, which is very interesting, thinking of Yitro as both the, what you're saying, pure justice, but he's yeah.
I was interesting a while ago. I was talking to somebody, and I can't remember how this came up, but I asked him whether he acts as a consultant sometimes, and his response was, "I don't like being I don't like being a consultant to companies, because if I'm a consultant, they can take my advice or leave my advice. They can implement it or not." He said, if I'm going to invest in thinking about the company, I'm only willing to be a consultant if they'll put me on the board. If they'll put me on the board, then I'm invested, right? And then he says, then they're sort of more, and it's interesting that Yitro comes, gives his advice and leaves. And a year later, Moshe has another leadership crisis and appoints 70 elders. And you sort of say to yourself, well, where did all those judges go? And you wonder whether Moshe ever really implemented it. He said it was a good idea, but did he ever do it? And I do wonder about this notion of like sort of standing on the outside, giving the advice and then leaving, rather than following through. So I'm just going to finish off with one short idea, and then and this is an idea that I have read in the writings of Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, and also a colleague of mine, Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Gramat, who I think also teaches at Drisha sometimes. And they said something really remarkable, which I think fits with this explanation of Yitro that I have given. And they said the following: you remember the early stories of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe sees an Egyptian beating a Jew, and he gets involved, and he kills the Egyptian. And then he sees two Jews fighting, and he gets involved. And then he goes to the well side in Midian, and you might even imagine that he'd say, don't get involved. You got a police record in Egypt, don't get a police record in Midian. But he can't stop himself, and he intervenes. Moshe is a justice warrior. He sees oppression, and he's there. He's active. Okay, so now he's sitting around a burning bush, and God says, here, I've got a really good job for you. You're a justice warrior. I've got the ultimate oppression. The Jews are being oppressed. Take them out of Egypt. And you'd think that Moshe would say, this is my moment. This is what my whole career has been leading to. This is the money time, right? What does he say? Can't do it. What, me? Can't speak, can't act. Money, miani. By the way, interestingly enough, he says, I'm kvad peod, kvad lashon. There's that kaved word, right, which seems to come up in these stories. Moshe has this tendency to feel kaved, which, by the way, is an interesting antithesis to Pharaoh's hard heart, heavy heart, but that's another shir. Okay, so the question is, what happened to Moshe? Where did he lose his confidence? So do you know what Sri Gramat says in Moshe Lichtenstein? He met Yitro. And what does Yitro say? Don't get too involved. Don't get too involved. Remain on the sidelines. Don't affiliate with a particular people. Well, you're going to affiliate with the Jews? They just complain all the time. They're impossible, right? Keep objective, right? You believe in justice, but you're going to get involved with the Jewish people. And everything the Jewish people is always going to be perfect. So stay out of it. And indeed, Moshe says, I don't know if I want to. Until God pushes him into it and says, you're the guy, you have to do it, right? But it's very interesting that this association with Yitro might possibly have paralyzed Moshe. I come back to my introduction to this class. There is a tendency, especially in a postmodernist reality, where we see a lot of perspectives. Part of postmodernism is, there aren't these firm truths, but there are different narratives and different vantage points. And it's very, very difficult sometimes to make commitments. And I remember once giving this shir to some of my students at Pardes, and they very much identify with the way I portrayed Yitro. They said, it's actually interesting. Some of my students in Pardes, I don't know if it's the majority, but some of my students, it's definitely true by now, they say that if you take an average Jew in North America today, they're almost just as likely to have a one non-Jewish parent as one Jewish parent, right? In other words, at least half young American Jews will be the products of one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent. Now, if you're like that, then you've got a foot in both worlds, right? You've got a foot in the Jewish world and in the non-Jewish world. And a lot of them like it. A lot of them like that sense of multiple commitments, multiple association points, the notion of throwing in your entire lot with one people, with one spouse, right? It's very, very scary because, what does that mean? But if you don't get married, you're not really going to build a long-lasting home, right? This family is the touchstone of being able to build all of that. So, and by the way, let's not pretend that doesn't come with certain compromises, right? So I just find this very interesting. And I have to say, maybe I'll say a little bit of self confession here. I've also been having this dilemma with this current situation with the demonstrations going on in Israel. Every Motzei Shabbat, there's a demonstration protesting. And I don't love what's going on in this justice system, but I'm saying maybe some people will get up at the demonstration and say things that I don't like and I won't agree with. And then I say, but so you're not going to demonstrate in general because you're worried that you don't agree with the whole package? You've got to share about Yitro about this, yeah? And you should maybe agree to take a stand, even if it's not 100% perfect, right? And I say, well, yeah, but they're much more extreme than me. I go back and forth, and I suddenly find myself in this sort of place where I'm looking for the purism, for the view which perfectly matches me, but maybe there isn't always such a thing. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Something to think about, maybe a new vantage point about the man with seven identities, the eternal seeker, Yitro, and the way he interfaces with Bnei Israel. Of course, we stand at Mount Sinai and we say Na'aseh v'nishma, and we make our commitment, and we become the Jewish people, and we've affected civilization for the rest of time through our Torah, and through our traditions, and through what we have built. That doesn't mean that everything's perfect. So thank you. I don't know if there are any questions or comments. Please feel free.
There's some questions. If you see,
I'll
there's
look at
some
the chat.
questions
Sorry.
and comments on the chat.
I'm happy
Zella?
to read them to you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I've got them. I opened it now. Sorry, I was...
Yeah.
Hold on, I'm going to stop sharing and that'll make it easier. Hold on.
Okay.
Here we go. Here we go. Yeah, I like Stacey's comparison of temporary and summer camp and during Sukkot. Yeah, you know, the idea of permanence. But I will say that I think, you know, the notion of, let's say, moving to Israel and a totally Jewish country and being in that sort of parochial environment is very off-putting to some people. It's too narrow, right? It's a very interesting thing. So Zella says, where did Yitro say don't get involved? What I was trying to say is that he's unwilling to commit to Matan Torah and unwilling to commit to coming with the Jewish people. In that degree, he says don't get involved. The Midrash amplifies this even more. When the Midrash says that he didn't want to get involved, he left Pharaoh's court and withdrew to the desert rather than being an influencer. He just pulled out. There is another Midrash that I didn't read. It's at the top of page 3, but it's actually a fascinating one. The Midrash that Yitro is such a seeker that when he when Moshe married Zipporah, he made a deal that their first child should remain a sort of an open to worship idolatry or whatever it is, shouldn't be raised in the Jewish tradition. And that's why he wasn't given Brit Milah. That's why Moshe's oldest son wasn't given Brit Milah, because he was meant to be raised as sort of like Yitro himself, open. And Moshe got sort of in trouble for this, and that's why God came to take it out on Moshe. And ironically, it's Zipporah, because in Shemot, all the heroes are the women. It's Zipporah who understands she has to do Brit Milah. And Brit Milah is exactly another great example about this, because like, what are we doing in 8 days, marking our male children? Seems so extreme, right? I remember when my sister had their first child, and she was still in university, and all of her fellow university students were shocked and horrified that she was doing this to her poor little 8-year-old baby, and already making choices for him. How can you make such a choice? Let him decide when he grows up. You know, what is that? So that's okay. And I love Ruth's comment. The eternal seeker is the eternal doubter. Interesting. Anyway, thank you ever so much. I really appreciate everybody, and Litrot. Hopefully we'll have other occasions to learn Torah together.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Israel, and thank you so much, Rachel, as well. And of course, thank you so much to our learners that always join us. As you know, we always have many classes happening, and you can always register for classes and find out all the information on our website, including the recordings for classes at www.drisha.org. להתראות, everyone.